I have an in-studio guest, someone from actually my distant past, Dr. Mitch Glaser, and I work together in another ministry. He is currently president of Chosen People Ministry, and that headquarters in New York. We'll give contact information just a little bit later. Mitch Glaser, welcome back.
Shalom, Jan. Wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much. You know, I've spent a lot of time on your website, and I happened to listen to your testimony, and even though I am very familiar with your background, there were some things I didn't know. And I find it fascinating. I want to ask you a little bit about it.
Sure.
Because you say in your testimony, you say you're an unlikely person to believe in Jesus. You grew up visiting grandparents, seeing pictures of relatives who were victims of the Holocaust. And you said in the mind of your family members, they died because of Jesus. Yeah. And in your mind, Jesus and Christianity were your enemy.
Absolutely. I was born in Brooklyn, the true Holy Land, Jan. And then moved to another place, suburb of Brooklyn called Queens. That's a New York joke. It's another one of the 5 boroughs. And I lived in a Jewish bubble. I mean, everybody I knew was Jewish. I went in school, there were Gentiles, but I don't think my parents ever had a non-Jewish person in our home. And we just lived in a very, very Jewish environment. When it came time for me to be bar mitzvahed, my parents sent me to a very Orthodox Hebrew school. I went 5 days a week after school from ages 8 through 13. I was required to be there Friday night and Saturday. I learned the Hebrew Bible, learned Jewish history, and honestly, I loved it. I really enjoyed it. If somebody would ask me, did you find a personal relationship with God as a result of all this, I would say that was lacking.
Well, you probably were a representative of a lot of Jews. This was a cultural thing you were doing. This wasn't a very spiritual thing.
Well, no, this was part of our heritage. My grandparents were very Orthodox, and so they wanted me to go. And it was just absolutely normal for Jewish kids, particularly young men like me, to go. But we took it a little further at times because it was so important to my family. I went to Orthodox Jewish sleepaway camp every summer.
Interesting. Well, you were eventually going to leave, though. You were going to head out to the West Coast and hook up with a couple of Jewish men. Actually, I think I even know who they were. I knew them, met them. And you got into the drug business, and I don't mean pharmaceuticals. You got into the hard drug business.
Yeah, well, I started doing drugs when I was 14. And my parents moved out to New Jersey when I was 15, and I was in college by the time I was 17. I actually was majoring in unregistered pharmacy.
Unregistered.
Right.
All right.
And then I had a minor in marketing. But it was a great cash business, and I made a lot of money. But I couldn't take really being at school anymore. It was holding me back in my career. And so we went out to the great state of California, myself and a couple of Jewish kids, built a houseboat in Sausalito, California, tore down a houseboat in Sausalito, California. Something about the building inspector wondering where the plans were. I mean, can you imagine? And then we moved into a house with a bunch of people in San Francisco. And I would say about that time I began searching.
Well, a Christian comes into your life based on the testimony I heard, and actually you went to some gathering. You suggested it might have been a Christian commune somewhere in Oregon, I think. I remember the part in your testimony that affected me so because they held hands to pray around the table, and you thought, what is this, a seance? I mean, you really didn't know what...
Right.
You also didn't know what really communing with the Lord meant.
No, I didn't, because I was raised more of an Orthodox Jew and studying Torah, being obedient to the commandments. And that was mostly it. Praying always in Hebrew, reading the Bible in Hebrew. Of course, I didn't understand Hebrew all that well. And so God was always quite distant. I would say God was far away. So my 2 best friends became believers in Jesus and moved into this commune in Oregon, Coospe, Oregon. And so I went up there to save them because obviously they were brainwashed because Jews don't believe in Jesus, right? At least I was raised that way. And when I got up there, I met the guy who ran the place, and he had a long, long beard and no mustache, so he kind of looked like a cross between a Hasidic Jew and an Amish person, and bald. And so he was quite a dramatic figure. So I just wanted to argue with him, but I thought I would wait till after dinner because, there was fresh blackberry pie baking in the oven. So we all sat around the table, and there were like 25 of us. I mean, it was a lot of people. So all of a sudden, as you just said, people actually I thought they fell asleep. I mean, they just kind of nodded out. And then people started putting their hands out to hold their hands, and two guys on either side of me wanted to hold my hand. I thought that was pretty weird. So I didn't hold their hands. And then all of a sudden at the head of the table, the old guy didn't close his eyes. He just looked up and he started speaking. And, for a quick moment, I was the only one looking at him. I thought he may have been speaking to me. And but I didn't say anything. It's a good thing, because then he called me Lord, but it wasn't me. And so obviously he was praying, but I wasn't used to this, because growing up in a Jewish home, first of all, the major prayer is after you eat. There's a lot of wisdom to that. Think about it. And so you pray after you eat. It's a quick prayer over the bread and the wine sometimes before you eat. But here's what happened. Everybody's heads are bowed. They're holding hands. He's speaking. Over the course of a few moments, which seemed like almost an eternity, his voice just got softer and softer and softer. And the room was just filled with a palpable presence. I mean, you could just reach out and feel it. And immediately I knew it was God.
You did.
And I never experienced anything even close to this in my life, synagogue or anywhere. And I knew that this presence was the one that I was fighting against. And I knew that I was going to lose, because this presence was so powerful.
Well, you were going to eventually say, God, if you're really there, show me. And you end up running into a Bible in a phone booth.
Well, what happened was I wanted to know what that presence was. And so the old guy told me to read my Bible. And so he handed me a Bible with an Old and New Testament. And he said, the thick part is your Bible, right? I said, yeah, that's right. And so I began reading. And I saw that Abraham and David and all of the prophets and all my heroes from Hebrew school, they all had this relationship with God. And it seemed like they knew God personally. And I had just experienced God. And so, this was all working together. And finally, one day I just said, if you're there, show me, and show me how to get to you. And I was working in a campground situation, teaching urban kids about the woods through the Marin County Board of Education, 60 miles south of San Francisco at the time. And so one of my kids wouldn't go to sleep. And remember, I was an experienced camp counselor. I went to camp a lot. And so I took him down to the phone booth. And if you're listening and you don't know what a phone booth is, you can look it up in Wikipedia. And so on the ledge where there should have been a phone book, instead of a book, there was a copy of another book that was kind of small, newspaper covered. It was kind of glowing in the moonlight. Now, a lot of things were glowing for me, Jan, at that time. But this one was really glowing, and one of the moonbeams through the redwood trees was just hitting this. It was very dramatic. It was late at night, and I sort of forgot about the prayer I had prayed. But I looked at this book, picked it up, looked at the chapters. And they were weird chapters. It said Matthew, Mark, John, Corinthians. I never heard of them. And I didn't know what it was. And of course, I finally realized on the front it says, real small, Modern English version of the New Testament. It was the American Bible Society's Good News for Modern Man. And so I stole it and began reading it and discovered immediately two things. Number one, Jesus was Jewish. I couldn't believe it.
Couldn't believe it.
Well, it doesn't look like that in his pictures.
You're right. They have Gentilized him.
They have. And so I began, I just couldn't believe that Jesus was Jewish. I challenge anybody listening to show me one instance where Jesus celebrated Christmas or Easter.
You're listening to Understanding the Times Radio. I'm Jan Markell. I have in studio with me Dr. Mitch Glaser. He heads Chosen People Ministries out of the heart of New York City, but they have branches in 16 countries. And we'll say more about that as we move along, but I wanted to get to Mitch's testimony because I think that it would be an encouragement to a lot of listeners. So, Mitch, you had to suddenly deal with something that was pretty tough to deal with, and that's your own depravity.
Well, I realized that Jesus was Jewish. It was shocking. But then I skipped right over and realized that he was God in the flesh. A lot of Jewish people have problems with the incarnation. But for me, I don't know. I thought to myself, if anybody was like God, he should be. They would be him. And the more I read, the more I was attracted to Jesus. And I love the Sermon on the Mount and Matthew 11, come unto me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And I really needed rest for my soul. And one day I just realized that everything that he said about sin was what my real problem was. It's very hard to diagnose yourself. And it was almost like the New Testament and the person of Jesus was a mirror for me. And I began to realize my own sin, and I realized that he had the cure for it. He had the solution. But I had one more problem, Jan. I had a Jewish mother.
Okay.
Okay? And so I remember I wanted to accept Jesus because my friends had told me what to do, but I couldn't. And I said, "You don't understand. You don't have a Jewish mother." Well, he did. And I knew it right away. And so I accepted Jesus, and my life began changing, but I began changing from the inside out. I mean, I was being transformed. And then I would read the New Testament and find out that the Bible spoke about what was happening to me. And that just affirmed my faith, and I kept growing.
Well, you had a dark side that you had been living, obviously, and you had sold drugs to kids. I would think a lot of guilt.
Well, I was a kid myself, Jan, but I did sell drugs to other teenagers like myself. And I realized that I'd done a lot of harm. And I was a lousy son. I mean, I wasn't, my parents didn't deserve me, you know. And so eventually I went back to my parents and told them that I'd become a believer in Jesus. I didn't tell them the best way possible, but I did my best. And enrolled in Bible college at that time as well. And, you know, everything a Jewish mother would never want. Good news is I'm back in college. The bad news is it's a Bible college. I'm not going to become a doctor. I'm going to become a missionary to my own people. So, I mean, it was really difficult on my good parents, but they loved me anyway.
Did they ever come around spiritually?
Before my mom died of cancer, I believe she came around, not just because it was a deathbed conversion, but God actually gave my mom, who we prayed for years and years. I was already 40 years a believer when my mom finally, I believe, came to the Lord. And it was really through a Haitian Baptist home health care worker that God gave my mother while she was so ill. And she was a godly woman and really ministered to my mother. And so, you know, Paul says in Romans 11:11 that Gentiles are to make Jewish people jealous. And that really works.